Gordon is a very different engine now than he was back in the 20s, and I think he deserves some credit for that. This particular story took place during the 90s at some point. It was one of his first conversations with one of the new engines at the time, Nia. Now, you'll have to forgive me. I'm not doing Nia's voice as much justice as I'd like to. It's certainly not an authentic Kenyan accent. But it's as close as I could get while still maintaining some level of illusion. So, at any rate, bear with me, and enjoy. The big engine was sitting quietly on one of the entrance lines to Tidmouth Sheds. There were only 4 of them. Most of the berths were around the turntable, inside the big, airy roundhouse. It was typically considered selfish or rude to take a whole entry line for yourself when there were others available inside. But this rule, like many others, did not seem to apply to Gordon. After all, who was going to move him? Nobody. That was the answer. Not even Murdoch would dare. And besides, thought Gordon to himself, he was tired, and using the turntable took more energy than he was willing to expend right now. His Express was the great love of his life, even after all these years. But these days, it took every ounce of breath he had. He'd been doing this for a long time, longer than his designer had ever intended for him. He was the last engine of his kind doing this sort of work. That was not lost on him. No one had expected him to last this long. Nobody, of course, but himself. It was no surprise to Gordon what he was capable of. But all the same, he was absolutely winded right now. He tried not to make it obvious, catching his breath in slow, steady inhalations. To most engines, he would appear quite relaxed. My, you look like you've just run a marathon. To most engines, that is. All except for this new one, who just wouldn't stop pestering him. Gordon groaned.
Hello, Nia.
Hello, my big blue friend. Why the red face? Heavy run today? Gordon gave her a side eye. She didn't mince words. If someone was struggling, she simply had to bring attention to it. Some engines, Gordon thought, would rather be left to struggle in silence. He thought of saying something biting to make her go away, but then he just sighed. She meant well. And more to the point, she was right.
Yes, 14 carriages, to Barrow and back, and my window keeps getting smaller.
Have you spoken to Sir Topham Hatt about it?
Gordon narrowed his eyes with contempt for the notion. He spoke one word. Never.
Why not? Perhaps he can lighten your workload.
Pooh! The express engine spat. That, my girl, is the last thing I would ever want. A heavy express means a healthy railway. And to that end, I will strain my couplings as far as they go, and maybe even past that point.
Both were quiet for many moments. Nia considered his words. They were blunt and a bit harsh, but also admirable. In a roundabout way, Gordon had just claimed that he was holding up the whole railway. She wondered if that could be true, at least in part. Either way, it was quite clear that Gordon would do that if ever asked. And that alone was worthy of praise. But he broke the silence before she could give it.
And anyway, there's nothing he can do. If he could make it easier on me, he would have. There's no more slack left in the schedule. I must make do.
But Nia knew he couldn't do that indefinitely. Gordon's fittings were just barely beginning to leak steam, and everywhere a pipe or tube threaded into his boiler, his bright blue was smearing with black soot. Now he was polished frequently, and lovingly, so these were the marks of age, not neglect. Those great big grizzly eyebrows were starting to turn gray. You need a break. I know it's a difficult situation, but the Fat Controller is a smart man. He can find a way to give you the rest you need without risking the railway. Gordon lost patience. He was trying to do his part, and here she was tempting him with compromise. It was only making things harder for him. He snapped.
This may be hard for you to understand, but not all of us want to take advantage of the Fat Controller's generosity.
Oh. Nia sunk backwards a little, as if she'd been struck. Gordon regretted it almost immediately upon saying it. Even more so when he saw Nia's mouth twist into a pout. If he had been a younger, vainer engine, he might have doubled down. But he was an older engine now. He knew remorse.
I'm sorry, Nia. I did not mean that.
Gordon prepared for a long, drawn-out apology, and one of those dreaded heart-to-hearts he found himself engaging in more and more these days. But to his surprise, Nia showed great reserve. Her response was surprisingly gracious. "You are right about one thing. He was generous. I had nowhere else to go. When my railway went under, the only companies in Kenya that wanted me were scrap merchants. I had heard stories of Sodor, you know, even a continent away. But I never dreamed I'd get to see it."
Yes, well, I never dreamed we'd be sending Thomas on a bloody world tour. But it happened. It really shouldn't be any surprise to me that he brought back friends. He just can't help himself, can he?
No, he can't. It was a very interesting experience, traveling with him. He's an engine who loves taking chances. Some of them nearly got us killed, but then he took a chance on me, and invited me here.
Yes, without any of our approval, too. Even the fat controllers.
Gordon saw Nia's face fall again. He caught himself.
Not that I don't want you here, you see. It's just, he should have used the proper channels.
But Gordon knew that was a losing battle. It seemed as though every other engine that crossed that bridge made a home on Sodor, and had done so without the approval or oversight of the powers that be. And considering those powers had been BR for years, Gordon couldn't deny that disregard for authority was a good thing in most cases. But it wouldn't have been dignified to say that out loud. "I'm surprised Sir Stephen was able to negotiate my purchase. I was sure they would say no." But Gordon's skeptical frown vanished, and a grand, wide grin replaced it. He guffawed so loudly the rails shook.
Oh, Nia, my dear girl. No one says no to the fat controller.
And he was right, of course. Nia's wistful expression was replaced with that impish grin Gordon had grown to dread. He knew that something clever was coming. She was like Thomas in that way, but with brains. Which actually made her very little like Thomas indeed. At last the grin spoke. "I have never heard you laugh before, Gordon. I like it."
"Thank you,
"You're welcome." The innocence in her voice was palpable. He was searching for irony, some sort of underlying cheekiness or humor, but it wasn't there. She really did just mean it. Perhaps Sodor could use some of this positivity, he thought. But, again, he only ever said these things in his head. "Perhaps you would laugh more often if you had enough breath to do it." And there it was again. She was so insistent. Nobody else dared. Even Edward had agreed to leave Gordon be until he came to the conclusion on his own. And what conclusion was that? An unacceptable one.
I cannot retire. Not yet.
"You don't have to retire, Gordon. You just need a little help. Maybe let Henry or Bear take a train now and then. They seem strong enough."
Physically, perhaps. But have they the reserve? I think not.
"And what if there were a suitable replacement? Would you want to step down then?" The gall of this little engine! It astounded Gordon, almost impressed him. He hadn't been challenged like this in a long time, maybe ever. Edward had always been so delicate in his suggestions, and Thomas had always been so cheeky. But Nia was simply being honest. Gordon respected honesty, above all else. He would often declare that he was the fastest, the biggest, the best. But these claims, they never came from a place of ego. To him, it was an objective truth. And indeed, if you gathered all the best engineers and statisticians in one room, and they took their PSI gauges and measuring tapes to the engine, they would probably prove him right. And now, this little orange tank engine from the other side of the Empire, or what once was part of the Empire, was acknowledging an objective reality that even Gordon struggled to be honest about, that he was, in fact, getting old.
Frankly, I don't think I would ever want to step down. This is what I was always meant to do.
Pull the wild nor'wester, you mean?
Well, no, not exactly. I was intended to run the LNER.
The word choice was important. Run. Not just run on. Gordon had imagined himself not just as a member of that railway, but the keystone, the founder even. He was, after all, the First Pacific. That was no small title. His old green eyes grew sad and wistful, and he said,
But that didn't work out as planned. The wild nor'wester is my consolation. It isn't London to Edinburgh, but, well, it's the closest thing there is.
This stirred something in Nia, something familiar. So you feel your heart is somewhere else? In all his long years on this railway, Gordon had never put the feeling into words before. But those were the words.
I suppose you could say that.
I know how that feels. And Nia looked up at him, somberly. I'm grateful to be here. Don't think that I'm not, but I had to leave everything behind. And I miss it. Gordon fell silent. The mighty engine's boiler groaned, long and low, the way it always did when he was settling down after a strenuous run. But he'd been in this shed for an hour now. So why was he only now feeling relieved? The words that left his blast pipe surprised him. They were the only dignified words to use.
I'm sorry. That must have been very trying.
It was. Nia's long lashes flickered a few times. Gordon wondered if she was going to cry. But she'd been shouldering this sadness for a long time now. She was far past tears.
But, you knew your home, didn't you? You had friends and family, yes?
I did. The sadness mixed with the warmth of old memories. It was a bittersweet face that she made.
Then that is a gift, my dear girl. You know, sometimes I feel like my real destiny was on the LNER. I never worked there, you know. It was the GNR who built me. The LNER was formed after I left. I was only there long enough to see the beginnings of it, but never what it grew into.
Nia's sadness reflected Gordon like a high-shine mirror. Her empathy was undeniable. And you're left wondering what they're all doing now that you're gone, living their lives without you.
Well, not any more. My family is all gone. But they lived a good 40 years without me, and their adventures are the stuff of legend. Not children's books, mind you, legend. And I suppose I would have liked to be there for it all.
And I wish I was back home now. But home is already changing. Many of my friends have gone to other railways or worse places. With considerable willpower, Nia stopped her lip quivering and summoned a smile. But there's no reason to dwell on it. I miss my friends and my home, but I am lucky to be here now. So I appreciate the bright side, and I keep on chugging. Gordon simmered in quiet agreement, pressing his lips close together in contemplation.
Keep calm and carry on.
Nia's smile broadened at hearing this. She chuckled softly. Gordon's stiff upper lip erupted into an indignant frown.
You laugh? Well, the cheek.
Nia was still smiling when she said, I don't mean to offend you, Gordon. It's just... you are so British. Gordon's stiff upper lip replaced itself. A vague smirk accompanied it.
And proud of it.
If Gordon had known half of Britain's influence in Nia's home country, he might have felt very differently. But that was a conversation for another day. For the moment, his patriotism was more quaint than anything else. And somehow, no matter what he heard about his queen or country, Nia doubted that he'd ever be able to shake it. He seemed to be a creature of habit. Nia considered this thought. You care a lot about tradition, don't you, Gordon?
Very much so,
he said, without hesitation. He knew who he was. And traditions can be good, but sometimes they can end up trapping you. The world changes. We can't stay the same forever. Again, she stole a glance at Gordon's leaking pipes. He grumbled to himself for a moment, and then gazed back down at the low-slung tank engine.
Can you keep a secret?
I can try. The cheekiness showed itself again, but it was good enough for Gordon.
I do not like change.
Nia only laughed again. It was a dreadfully obvious thing to say. Does anyone?
No, I suppose not. But I especially detest it. Things had ought to just stay the same. We figured it all out a long time ago. Our railway, our country. Why have we got to shake things up?
Nia responded softly but firmly. Well, you are glad I'm here, aren't you? Gordon sighed. She had a point.
Yes, you are quite decent and sensible. And you've made no small dent in the workload. Anyone who can stop the Caledonians complaining has got my vote.
Then that's one change you support. Gordon considered.
I don't like changes while they're happening, but with things being different, I can live with that.
That, Nia thought, made quite a lot of sense. So, you'd rather pull the express until you can't anymore. You don't want to wind down slowly. You want it to all happen at once.
Now we understand each other.
And he grinned, then let off steam tremendously.
Speaking of which, there are a few hundred people with a train to catch.
And he looked back impressively.
And that train is me.
And with a deafening chime that could be heard from Ireland, Gordon the big engine trundled backward over the master switches and toward the colossal station at the other end of the yard. He approached his train with confidence. The days of his coaches not being ready or having to shunt them himself were long over with. Tidmouth had a small fleet of pilots now who handled everything with great efficiency. The yard was truly at peak efficiency. Except, of course, for the one big blue engine who is now pushing 70, leaking steam and growing wearier all the time. But he wouldn't give up until he couldn't do it anymore, and for all his waning strength and stamina, he could still do it. And when he roared by the sheds on his way out, giving Nia a firm and friendly blast on the whistle, she nearly went deaf from the sound of his wheels alone. He was still the fastest and best, if only by a little bit now. Nia just smiled. That was that, she said to herself. The last engine she'd had to win over. It finally felt like home. A new home, and one that she'd still need a few years to truly settle into. But home, nonetheless. She backed up slowly, and came to a rest on one of the entry lines. Her impish grin said it all.